So for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing King Kong vs. Godzilla, the overall third installment in both the King Kong and Godzilla franchises. So I bet you're wondering how the idea for this movie even came about. Well, it all started when everybody wanted to get into a fist fight with Frankenstein. Well, at least the monster. Yeah, no joke. After Godzilla Raids Again became a box office hit, Toho saw potential in making these giant monster movies. And this gave Toho the brilliant idea to make a whole string of giant monster movies, just without the usage of the Godzilla character, since Toho wanted to expand their horizons. And the first of these non-Godzilla movies to come out was the 1956 film Rodan. So with Rodan, both the monster and the movie, becoming a big hit with both Japanese and American audiences, this only opened the doors for Toho even further. And from there on out, the studio made several other giant monster movies, ranging from the likes of the Mysterians, Varan the Unbelievable, to Mothra, and so forth. And in between making these giant monster movies, Toho also made several other science fiction movies that weren't related to the giant monster movie genre, making such films from Half Human to The H-Man. And out of the non-giant monster movies that Toho wanted to make a sequel to, Toho essentially wanted to make a sequel to a film called The Human Vapor. In terms of what the sequel would have been about, it would have taken place sometime after the events of the first Human Vapor movie, in which the title character, the Human Vapor, would have somehow survived the events of the first movie, but only to discover that his lover had died during the film's climax. And while moping and doping, he soon discovers that a scientist not only managed to find the dead body of the Frankenstein monster, but also managed to successfully revive it, thus giving the Human Vapor the idea of kidnapping this scientist in order to resurrect his dead lover. However, this would only lead into a battle between the Human Vapor and Frankenstein's monster. However, plans for the movie got scrapped, but Toho didn't give up on the idea of featuring Frankenstein's monster in one of their own movies. Then sometime later, someone at Toho Studios was like, you know what, it's time to bring back Godzilla. How can we bring back Godzilla? Wait, do we still want to make a movie featuring the Frankenstein monster? I got it. Why don't we feature a movie in which the Frankenstein monster battles Godzilla? This would eventually become an idea for a new movie called Frankenstein vs. Godzilla. In regards to what the movie would have been about, it would have been about these two scientists who have been studying the effects of radiation on survivors from the Hiroshima bombings. They both come across a small boy roaming the streets of Hiroshima, and then they begin to study the child and discover that the boy is in fact Frankenstein's monster. However, because of the effects of radiation, the small boy begins to grow quickly in size to a point where he becomes giant-sized and starts feasting on livestock. Upon hearing this, the Japanese self-defense force worries that once Frankenstein's monster stops feasting on livestock, the monster would eventually find a new source of food in the form of humans. This would lead to the Japanese military believing that Frankenstein would become a great threat to Japan and decide that it was time to free Godzilla from his icy tomb, believing that Godzilla was the lesser of two evils. After freeing Godzilla from his icy tomb, the Japanese would start luring Godzilla to Japan in order to fight off the Frankenstein monster. And upon reaching Japan, Godzilla would eventually come into contact with the Frankenstein monster, and the two would eventually battle one another. While Frankenstein vs. Godzilla was put into production, meanwhile at Universal Studios, some guy was like, you know what, it's time to bring back King Kong. And apparently they either found or stole some type of screenplay that was written by Willis O'Brien, the original stop-motion animator for the 1933 King Kong movie. And in regards to what the screenplay was about, it would have featured King Kong in San Francisco battling a monster that was made up of several different animals that was created by the grandson of Dr. Frankenstein. So while Universal was trying to find someone to make King Kong vs. Frankenstein into a movie, somehow, one way or another, Universal discovered that Toho was making Frankenstein vs. Godzilla. And Universal apparently sent their King Kong vs. Frankenstein script to Toho. And Toho, at that exact point in time, wanted to have King Kong fight their own monster, Godzilla, instead of Frankenstein. And after working out a deal with Universal and RKO, the original copyright holder of King Kong at the time, Toho finally began to work on their most successful science fiction film to date, King Kong vs. Godzilla. Although a few changes had to be made to the King Kong character, the big one being King Kong's size, because the size of King Kong in the original 1933 movie, he was roughly 125 feet tall, whereas Godzilla at the time was 164 feet tall. So if the monsters were to have a two-scale match with one another, it would be extremely one-sided. So Toho essentially took their Frankenstein versus Godzilla script and replaced the Frankenstein monster altogether with King Kong, and made some changes to the script that would incorporate more elements that were related to King Kong. And while Toho was in the process of making the movie, they realized that the premise to King Kong vs. Godzilla was pretty absurd, and essentially when the Japanese cut of the movie hit theaters, it was presented more as a comedy, or so I am told, whereas the American cut of the movie was re-edited and essentially turned into more of a serious science fiction movie. And when production of the movie was finally complete, King Kong vs. Godzilla hit theaters worldwide, and when it did, the earth literally trembled before the might of King Kong vs. Godzilla, becoming a smash hit with audiences from across the globe, becoming one of the most successful Godzilla films within the franchise. So, how successful was King Kong vs. Godzilla? Well, King Kong vs. Godzilla would become the highest grossing Godzilla film within the franchise. Not only back in the day, but also by today's standards. Like, it's still the highest grossing Godzilla film to date. Hell, the idea proved so popular that Toho attempted to remake King Kong vs. Godzilla during the early 90s, but that's a story for another time. Although with the combination of the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe along with the 2014 Godzilla film, Warner Brothers and Legendary decided that they were going to make their own cinematic universe revolved around giant monsters, starting with the 2014 Godzilla movie and ending with the 2020 film Godzilla vs. Kong, which will finally give giant monster fans the rematch between cinema's greatest movie monsters that is 58 years in the making. Also, this film has some significance for me since this was my introduction to Godzilla, well, at least the Japanese incarnation of the character. What do I mean by this? Well, when I was 7 years old, I loved dinosaurs, and you could probably guess that I watched a lot of TV shows and or movies that featured dinosaurs or creatures that were similar to dinosaurs in them. And like any kid who liked dinosaurs, I watched Jurassic Park a lot. But sometime later, I remember my mother renting a movie that featured a giant dinosaur-like creature going on a rampage in New York City, that being the 1998 film Godzilla. And yeah, I watched this film a lot as well, along with the TV show. Sometime later during one Christmas, I got really sick and had to stay home, and I just remember my dad put on this older monster movie, that being the 1933 King Kong movie, and as I sat there watching the film, I was like, where's Godzilla when you need him? Now keep in mind, I was thinking about the 1998 version of Godzilla, not the Japanese version. But it wasn't until I was in the 3rd grade when I watched King Kong vs. Godzilla for the first time, and this was my introduction to the big G. But not in the way you would think, because when I started watching the movie, it was already halfway through when King Kong broke free from the raft, and that was my introduction to that movie version of King Kong. And as the movie progressed, we only kept seeing just King Kong. I was like, okay, this movie's called King Kong vs. Godzilla. Where the hell is Godzilla? And then the first fight happens, and I get my first look at Godzilla in the movie. I was like, he looks nothing like the one I'm used to seeing. But then as soon as this version of Godzilla appears, he immediately uses his atomic breath on King Kong, and at that exact moment, I was like, I already like this version of Godzilla a lot better than the one I'm used to seeing. Now, that being said, with Godzilla vs. Kong set to be released in the year 2020, was King Kong vs. Godzilla a masterpiece or a happy accident? As for the plot of the movie, after a submarine accidentally unleashes Godzilla from his icy tomb, a pharmaceutical company seeks out a monster to combat Godzilla by going to a remote tropical island and capturing the gigantic ape known as King Kong. When the pharmaceutical company makes landfall, the mighty Kong frees himself and confronts Godzilla. The two titans proceed to engage in battle, while the future of mankind hangs in the balance. Now, before I go any further, unlike the previous 2 Godzilla movie reviews in which I talked about both the Japanese and American counterparts in terms of what worked and didn't work for each cut of the movie, with King Kong vs. Godzilla, I'm only going to talk about the American cut of the movie since that's the only version I have access to. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on with the review. In terms of what I liked about the movie, the model work in regards to the buildings and landscapes are pretty good as usual, and it's actually nice to see everything in color because this was the first movie to be featured in color, so it's nice to see the amount of coloration and details on all the model work, regardless if it's a building or landscape. And I do like how this movie has some slight continuity with the previous installment, that being when we first see Godzilla in this movie, we see him escaping from his icy tomb from the climax of Godzilla Raids Again. I thought that was a nice nod to Godzilla Raids Again. And the movie actually has some good pacing until the American scenes arrive, but outside of those American scenes, I do think that the movie moves at a nice fluid pace. Then again, the movie has some good production values in general, not just in the form of the miniatures, but also once in a while you do see a good detailed matte painting from time to time. That is chroma keyed rather well with the live action water when you first see Pharoh Island. I also like the various references to various aspects of the production history for the Godzilla franchise seen within the movie. The first one being the reference to the beast from 20,000 Phantoms, because at one point in time you have one of the main characters saying that Godzilla is currently swimming at 20,000 Phantoms, and I don't know if this is indeed a reference to the beast from 20,000 Phantoms, or if I'm just reading too much into this, but I just thought that was a nice detail they added to make a reference to the original production history of Gojira. I also like the fact that the movie uses stop motion at some points in time, more specifically near the end of the film, in which you have Godzilla jump kicking King Kong, because not only is this a reference to the original 1933 King Kong movie that was done entirely in stop motion, it's also a nice reference to the production history of the 1954 Gojira movie, in which the original visual effects were meant to be stop motion at one point, but the people, while making that movie, discovered that this would have taken too long to make, and this would have cost a lot of money, which is why they went with the suitmation instead. So having that little moment of stop motion was a nice touch to the stop motion history of both King Kong and Godzilla. Then you have the scene revolved around the giant octopus, and I want to talk about this scene for several reasons. The first reason being the technical aspects of this scene altogether, because not only do we have a live octopus interacting with small miniatures to make itself look larger, but we also have some chroma key shots of the natives fighting off the giant octopus. There's even a point in time in which we see a puppet octopus interacting with King Kong. So essentially this whole sequence was brought together using different methods of special effects, regardless if it was puppets, stop motion, chroma key, to using 4 live octopuses. The second aspect I want to bring up is the fact that I kind of view this particular sequence as a reference to the production history of the original 1954 Gojira movie, because if you remember watching the intro to that particular video, I say that at one point in time, Godzilla was considered at one point in time to be a giant octopus. So I kind of view this sequence as being a reference to that. And we do have a scene in which King Kong fights the giant octopus, so if Godzilla did end up being the giant octopus instead of a dinosaur, this is probably what the fight would have looked like in the long run. Hell, this scene was so popular that it kind of got remade in the 2017 Skull Island movie, in which you see that version of Kong battling a giant cephalopod sort. So the scene does have influence. And speaking of influence, it's also had a lot of influence within pop culture as well, because back in the day, this was a very memorable scene to a point where many of the American distributors of the Japanese movies told Toho that the next film they should make should involve a giant octopus. And Toho did indeed add a giant octopus in Frankenstein Conquers the World, but that's a whole nother story entirely. And as many people know, this was also the scene that served as inspiration behind the Kraken that was used for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Also, the fight cinematography this time around is handled a lot better, because with the battle between Godzilla and Anguirus seen in Godzilla Raids Again, the way that fight was shot was primarily using nothing but a series of wide shots with the footage sped up, and there was really not much variety other than the occasional close-ups with the puppets. With this movie, on the other hand, the fight cinematography between King Kong and Godzilla is a lot better. Like, sure, we do have those wide shots, but we also get extreme close-ups, mid-body shots, tilted angles. There's a lot more variety in the layout of how the fight is presented, and the fight isn't sped up like it is in Godzilla Raids Again. I also like the way Kong gets captured in this movie, because unlike many versions of King Kong which the humans use some type of special weapon or chemical to knock him out, King Kong knocks himself out hilariously enough through a scene in which he drinks some red juice and gets drunk as a result, which I find to be so humorous, because I think this is the only time in film history where King Kong knocks himself out, allowing the humans to essentially capture him in that regard. Also, the decision for Toho to use King Kong to fight against Godzilla instead of Frankenstein was actually a brilliant idea on their behalf. And why I think this was such a smart move on Toho's behalf, let's actually look at the first half of the 20th century. Before Godzilla ever became popular, the first half of the 20th century belonged to King Kong. Everyone in the world over knew who King Kong was. And Toho saw the potential in making their own monster popular by pitting their own creation against the more popular monster, King Kong. And thank God they did, because if it wasn't for this movie, I don't think the Godzilla franchise would be as popular as it is today. Like, that's how popular King Kong was back in the day. And which is the reason as to why King Kong is both the main monster character that we follow throughout the movie and the one that actually wins the matchup, regardless of whatever version of the movie you watch. And speaking of the ending, let's actually talk about it, shall we? Because over the past several decades, there's always been like this weird dual myth that depending on what version of the movie you watch, King Kong wins in the American cut, which is the version I'm reviewing, and apparently Godzilla wins in the Japanese cut. And I don't exactly know why this occurred, but this has been an ongoing debate for decades, which I find to be very fascinating. Even someone like James Rolfe, who reviewed all the Godzilla movies, stated that he had to go to the library occasionally to read books to figure out who won the climax. It wasn't until the advent of the internet in which the truth was out there that no matter what version of the movie you watch, King Kong wins regardless. Even Toho themselves stated, yeah, that was the idea to begin with, because back in those days, King Kong was the more popular monster. It would have made a lot more sense to let the more popular monster win the matchup, as opposed to having this relatively new monster win the matchup. And as far as the human characters go in this movie, definitely a lot more memorable than the characters in the last movie, because as far as the two main characters go, they're very similar to the two lead characters from Godzilla Raids Again, but I actually remember them a bit more, because on one hand, yes, they do fill the role of main character and comical relief, but you had the main character who was fearless, but he was willing to joke around, whereas the other character was a scaredy cat, but was willing to get his hands dirty when needed to. Then you have their boss, Mr. Tako, who's essentially this head of a pharmaceutical company, and he's perhaps the most memorable character in the entire movie, because on one hand, he is really annoying in some instances, but he's also really comically greedy in other cases, because his motivation in the entire movie is to essentially boost his ratings by capturing a giant monster to gain publicity. Hence why he sends the two main characters to capture King Kong. And yeah, I know that's kinda different from what I said earlier in the plot synopsis, but whatever. He sends the two main characters to capture a giant monster. Hell, when King Kong first meets up with Godzilla, you have him and a bunch of other characters making bets in terms of who's gonna win, which is pretty hysterical for a bunch of human characters, because on one hand, there are definitely a lot of people in this movie who do the typical, it's Godzilla, and run away. But then you have this cast of main characters where they're sitting there watching the fight about to happen, they're making bets in terms of who's gonna win. And I can't think of any other cast of human characters within a Godzilla movie that make bets about which monster is going to win the bout. Then you have the natives of Pharoh Island who worship King Kong, and they're not your typical natives that you would see in a typical King Kong movie. Because it's something like the 33 King Kong movie or the 1976 King Kong movie, the natives still are really aggressive and demand a human sacrifice to appease Kong. Yet in this movie, they still worship him and they're aggressive to the main characters at first, but once the human characters introduce them to things like music and cigarettes, they become more friendly. Then you have the costumes for both monsters in the movie, and it's a hit and miss situation, because on one hand, I think that the Godzilla costume used in this movie looks really great, whereas the King Kong costume on the other hand, I think the face on it looks okay, but the rest of the body just looks terrible. Because with the Godzilla costume, there's no doubt that that particular costume is Godzilla. It has the skin texture, and it looks like Godzilla. With King Kong, on the other hand, besides the face, the rest of it doesn't look like an ape. It just looks like a fat guy who attempted to make an ape costume using a shitty rug. And the arms to the King Kong costume constantly change body length. Like, there's no consistency to it. So in terms of what I disliked about the film, also this first critique is more of a nitpick, that being this camera movement during the first scene involving the American anchor. I don't know what it is, but it's just one of those things where the camera does these tiny adjustments that it really doesn't need to do since the shot was already perfectly set up. And it does this maybe 2 to 3 times during that one sequence, but again, it is just a minor nitpick. In terms of the actual problems I have with the movie, let's start with the soundtrack to the film, because essentially we're in the exact same situation that Gigantus the Fire Monster went through, in which they replaced the soundtrack to the Japanese cut of the movie with soundtracks from other B movies. For this movie in particular, they used soundtracks from various movies ranging from The Creature from Black Lagoon and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman to several westerns. And I have several problems with this, because when a film composer creates a soundtrack for a particular movie, they essentially want to not only sync up the soundtrack with what's going on within the movie, but they also want the soundtrack to create a emotional response that correlates with the scene that's going on within the movie, to give it that emotional impact. With the soundtrack that's being presented here, there are definitely points in time where the soundtrack attempts to sound appropriate during certain scenes, but it doesn't deliver that emotional response like it should. And another problem that I have with the soundtrack to this movie is that with the American cut of the movie, they basically did this so that they can make this soundtrack sound more Western. And this really kills me, because in the Japanese version, apparently, the person who does the soundtrack for the Japanese cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla is Akira Ifukube, the same guy that not only provided the soundtrack to the original 54 movie, but also provided the soundtrack to many future Godzilla and Toho movies after this. So the fact that they replaced Akira Ifukube's soundtrack with other soundtracks from other movies really brings the movie down for me. Another problem that I have with the movie is the usage of stock footage, because one, I don't like it when movies use stock footage. Second, they play the exact same clips of stock footage over and over and over again. Like, they show the same shot of this spaceship like 6 to 8 times throughout the entire movie, or this one building like 2 to 4 times, or this submarine scene twice already. I mean, granted, the movie does use some stock footage during a climax, but it's used in an appropriate sense to make the ending more epic. But again, with the combination of the movie using stock footage in general, along with the repeated use of certain shots, it does get old pretty quickly. Another problem I have with the movie is when the movie cuts to the scenes revolved around the American characters. Because when we're focused on the footage from the Japanese movie, the movie moves at a fast pace and it's simple to follow. Yet when we cut to the American portions of the movie, it just stops the flow that the movie had going on earlier, and all these scenes really do in the long run is just added exposition that's not really needed, because again, they're explaining things that really don't need explanation. Also, the movie tonally is kind of confused in some points in time, because from what I gather, the original Japanese cut of the movie was meant to be a comedy, because like I said earlier, the movie has an absurd premise and it's just meant to be a dumb, goofy action-adventure flick. And for the most part, the Americanized version of King Kong vs. Godzilla is a lighthearted action-adventure, but when they intertwine the American scenes into the film, they try to make the film really serious, which I appreciate, but I don't think it works out in the long run. And also, in my opinion, this is the film in which the tone of the original 1954 Godzilla movie is lost. And yeah, I know most people like to point to Godzilla vs. Monster Zero being the film in which the tone of the original 1954 movie is lost permanently, and that does make sense because this film does have a sort of anti-nuclear weapon message, but it's so underplayed that this film might as well be the film that makes the tone of the original gone permanently, only because the premise of the movie is King Kong battling Godzilla. Like, when you have a movie with a premise like that, you kind of need to have the movie be a light-hearted action-adventure and not some dark, serious drama. And of course, like any movie, there's bound to be some kind of plot hole to this. With this one, there's 2 that come to mind. The first one being, when King Kong is knocked out, how in the hell did the pharmaceutical company make a gigantic raft large enough not only to float King Kong, but also how did they get King Kong from that particular area to the ocean in such a short amount of time? Like, there's no explanation behind it. It's basically Kong is knocked out, Next scene, you just see the boat towing the raft that has Kong sleeping on it. It feels like I'm missing something here. And also, in regards to the natives, we only see them in the first half of the movie, and that's it. We don't ever see them again. Also, if Kong is essentially their god, what exactly transpired in regards to the conversation between the people of the pharmaceutical company and the natives? Like, were the natives like, no, you can't take Kong off the island? Or were they like, you say you want to borrow our god? Oh, okay, here you go. Like, what about that sequence? I want to see what happened during that sequence. Then you have the points in time where the movie has some really outdated or bad composite shots. And when you look at a movie that has some composite shots, you would typically notice like this green or blue glow around the people that are composited. And in some points in time in this movie, there are some composite shots that look dated, but they get the job done. But then there are other points in time where the composite shots look so horrendous that the blue glow around the characters consumes the person to a point that they're physically blue in color. And it just adds a whole layer of unintentional goofiness to the movie. And continuing off the American scenes, some of the exposition that they give doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And I have two examples to back this up. The first one being when you have one of the characters explain the intellectual differences between King Kong and Godzilla, because when he's talking about King Kong, he says that King Kong is a thinking animal, while Godzilla, on the other hand, is a creature that relies more on natural instinct. Yet, when you do see Godzilla battling King Kong, there are several points in time in which Godzilla is shown thinking throughout the battle. And as for my second example, there's a point in time in which you have the American actors explaining King Kong's electrical powers, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of when they explain it, because even though I've seen this movie before and I'm aware of King Kong's electrical powers, it's just, if I was someone watching this for the first time, I would be extremely confused as to where this explanation came from, because when it does appear, it appears before King Kong uses his electrical powers, which makes me wonder, how did they know of King Kong's electrical powers? Did they foresee into the future, or was this like a production problem in which this scene was supposed to take place sometime afterwards? And speaking of King Kong's electrical powers, yeah, King Kong having the ability to absorb electricity really doesn't make a whole lot of sense within the context of the movie. Then again, this movie was originally supposed to be Frankenstein versus Godzilla, and whether or not that version of Frankenstein would have had a similar ability is entirely unknown, but I think that's the reason as to why King Kong has electrical powers. But there's also another aspect in relation to electricity that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. That being, electricity is Godzilla's greatest weakness within this film. And why this doesn't make any sense to me, because when you think back to the first movie, there is a scene in which Godzilla is seen attacking electrical wires. Sure, the electrical wires annoy him, but it wasn't his greatest weakness. Yet in this film, it's his greatest weakness. It's just a little continuity error that I'm noticing. And the movie near the end, before the climactic battle between King Kong and Godzilla, makes an unnecessary reference to the 1933 King Kong film in which King Kong goes on a rampage in the city and grabs the lead female character and climbs on top of this building. And really, this serves no purpose. Like, it doesn't add anything to the story, and there's really no reason for King Kong to pick up the lead female character. It's not like with the original King Kong movie in which the lead female character was offered to Kong as a sacrifice or a bride. This here, it's just randomly, he picks up a train, spots the lead female character, grabs her, and then just climbs a building. And it just doesn't add anything to this story, and I could have done without it. So from a final verdict of King Kong vs. Godzilla, although the movie did a lot for the Godzilla franchise, I don't think it's quite the monster classic that some people have made out to be over the years. Like the movie before it, King Kong vs. Godzilla is a very prototypey film, and in some cases a slight improvement over Godzilla Raids Again. However, it does have a lot of problems in regards to plot points and production values. That being said, I do think that King Kong vs. Godzilla can be enjoyed in a so bad it's good type viewing. Overall, I think King Kong vs. Godzilla is okay, and although the movie isn't my favorite film within the Godzilla franchise, I do respect what it did for the Godzilla franchise in the long run. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else say about King Kong vs. Godzilla? looks like the movie got generally mixed to negative reception. I'm not too surprised by this. Then again, what were these people expecting? And so, for my final rating of King Kong vs. Godzilla, I give it a 3 out of 5. Now that King Kong Godzilla will have an eventual rematch in the year 2020, who do you think is going to win the matchup? And see you later.